Since we're always a little bit pressed for time, I think we'll start close to on time this morning. So we're going to continue on with our study of the United States and Canada's foreign policy and obviously the importance of that. And before us as witnesses today from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies is Mr. Charles Dorn, the Professor of International Relations, Director of Canadian Studies, so welcome. And the Center for International Governance Innovation, Fen Osler-Hampson, thank you very much for coming. Distinguished Fellow, Director of Global Security and Political Program. The normal process, and I'm sure the staff have told you, we'll start with a presentation, and then we'll get right to questions from our colleagues, members of Parliament that are here. So I'm not sure who's decided to go first. It's really quite easy. Oh, so whatever.
We'll go in alphabetical order, Mr. Chair.
Okay. And then the floor is yours. It'll be Mr. Dorn. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's a distinct honor for me to be here to talk with you about something that is always important to Canada-U.S. relations, but which is probably at this point as important as it's been in a very long time. I wasn't quite sure about my instructions, so I tried briefly to respond to each of the questions. I guess I was given the option to choose questions, but I didn't do that. And I'm sure I have not responded adequately to any of the questions. But I'm just going to give you my brief response, okay? And it's exactly as I printed the thing out. First, regarding the first question, Canada, in my modest judgment, ought to attempt to tread lightly with President Trump, especially in interpersonal relations. Despite his public image of disputatiousness, he doesn't like interpersonal antagonisms, especially in his physical presence. It makes him uneasy. On the other hand, Canada ought to state, in my judgment, state its interests clearly and firmly. He listens. Be prepared for tough bargaining on issues of top priority. I would think trade and investment would get top attention. Industrial supply lines, as your parliamentary secretary very adequately, very nicely, and clearly expressed yesterday in Washington, industrial supply lines are very sensitive. Mr. Trump needs to know, he needs to be reminded how important an open border is to both of our countries. He also needs to know how well policed this border is in actuality and what a record of cooperation and security it has established. I know he knows these things. He just needs to be reminded of the value of them. Yet some of the, and this is the bottom line here, some of the most important policy impacts for Canada will not have anything to do with foreign relations. But because of the integration of the economies, some of the most important impacts will be from internal American policy decisions, such as the possibility of a large corporate tax reduction, vast increases potentially in infrastructure spending, and concerns, of course, changes in immigration and refugee policy. Response to the second question. In response to concerns Canada might have with commercial relations with Trump, the Trump administration, I think, could usefully be reminded that trade deficits and financial imbalances must be dealt with in a multilateral fashion, not primarily bilateral. That said, when balances are large, persistent, and negative for the United States, this particular government in Washington will complain, especially where the imbalances are not just structural. But trade between the United States and Canada is quite balanced. Anybody looking at this in the last 2 years can see this. The larger U.S. problems by far are with Mexico and with China. Third, in the past, or in response to the third question, in the past, Canada has sought a greater emphasis on bilateral relations with the United States. Fen Hampson and I have looked at this. He's actually been more involved in it on this, certainly on this side, but there's a history of discussion about that. Although NAFTA renegotiation is starting, or is at least slated to start, these relations in many issues now are predominantly bilateral relations. It appears that the United States will seek to strengthen rules of origin provisions, at least it would like to. The United States may seek to alter dispute panel resolutions or procedures. That's something I might as well admit to you, a proponent of NAFTA, strong proponent. I had something to do with discussion of these dispute panels a long time ago. But the current government in Washington is unhappy with them. The government has said something about giving greater attention to labor issues. I'm not quite sure what that, well, I do think I know what is involved there, but that really involves Mexico. It doesn't involve Canada, the United States. Okay, the fourth question. Again, truth in advertising. I've been a long-time advocate of enlarging the scope of NORAD Northcom responsibilities in the Arctic and offshore. And I do know that its responsibilities are only with surveillance and with monitoring. But that is key. That is absolutely key. And there's no two countries in the world that have coordinated this with a level of trust like Canada and the United States. Actually, I think about almost 100% of Americans don't know anything about how it operates. But I trust that you do. But I see little interest in moving in the direction that I am advocating. The United States is concerned that, however, and this is a different topic, the United States is very concerned that Canada spends only 1% of its GDP on defense. The United States puzzles over, and I'm sure I don't understand, how Canada could argue that it is unable to spend part of its proposed military budget, pushing these, as is understood south of the border, pushing these expenditures forward over a 20-year period. From the U.S. side, these budgetary maneuvers, I have to candidly say to you, because I'm an academic, I have to say that from the U.S. perspective, these look like budgetary maneuvers to try to avoid an increase in current defense expenditures, however wrong that interpretation may be. 5, I believe the United States will continue to favor close coordination of monitoring and surveillance. There's just no doubt about that. I just got through with participating in an Arctic task force of the Council of Foreign Relations, and we got into all of this, and one of the things we learned is there seems to be more disagreement bureaucratically inside the United States about how to respond to things than there is between Canada and the United States about surveillance. I guess that's good news. I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but I'll tell you this much. When push comes to shove, they always figure out which planes to send up. So I don't think there's going to be a real problem there. As the Arctic melts, more transits are occurring, more mining and oil drilling sites are opening up, and more commercial activity is taking place. Problems are multiplying. The Arctic Council has passed a forward-looking strategic statement on the preservation of Arctic fish stocks. Yet the countries with the largest fishing fleets, China, Taiwan, and Japan, are not members of this agreement. And I can tell you, looking at that Chinese, and there's this parallel talks going on here about fisheries, but I can tell you, looking at the size of that Chinese fishing fleet and looking at the subsidies, we've all heard on this side, we all subsidize to some degree the fishermen because they're always complaining. But the fact is that the amount of subsidies the Chinese have poured into that fishing, those fishing fleets, means those boats are going to have to go someplace. And I think, unfortunately, they've got their eyes on the Arctic. Closer coordination of security is inevitable involving the United States, Canada, and Greenland. Let's not forget about that, Greenland, Denmark. Russia is rapidly moving forward with reopening all of its old airfields in the Arctic. It has, as you know, some 20 icebreakers, including heavy icebreakers. The United States has barely 3. I say barely because I'm not sure that they all can get out there at the same time. So that's the way it is. Changes will be required, but so far the Arctic has not received a lot of attention from the Trump administration. That could change. Things change very fast down there. 6, the Trump administration has in my opinion, a first-rate set of appointments at the cabinet level and an excellent National Security Council. Now, all my academic friends say, oh, that's ridiculous. There are no academics there. How could that be? What kind of experience have these people had? Let me tell you, Tillerson has done more deals and talked with more people and thought about international politics more effectively than most people who are nominees for that position. So one shouldn't underestimate that kind of talent. They aren't very good at getting the other appointments in place, and that's taking a while. The Trump administration hopes for improved relations with Russia. Shock. But so far, I've been quite disappointed in matters involving Syria. And of course, it all got involved in campaign issues. And, the press and the opposition has made it, well, opposition comes from a lot of sides, has made this issue something that means that it's very difficult to actually look at what is going on here. But the Trump administration is, I don't think, naive about this. They simply say, why do we have to have these battles with Putin all the time? And they realize that part of it is over status, because previously it was said by somebody that Russia was only a regional power. Now, if you want to irritate the Russians, that's the way you do it. In my opinion, they're a great power that is on hard times. It's certainly in economic terms. So, Russia is a controversial issue in Washington right now. Russia bungled the sarin gas affair. Just absolutely no question or doubt about it. I don't know if they had previous information. I'm sure they wouldn't have supported it, not because they were morally concerned, but because they thought it would have been bad policy. But it happened, and then they ended up defending the Syrians. And that made virtually everybody in Washington angry. That was a mistake. Nonetheless, the Trump administration is determined to continue to acknowledge Russia as an important member of the great power system. NATO is viewed by the Trump administration now as a critical defense alliance, as opposed to what was said during the campaign. But the Trump administration would like the Europeans to do more to help defend themselves. Surprise? Hardly. Evidence exists that these preferences are beginning to be taken seriously. Seventh question. The Trump administration is on record as getting even tougher with ISIS, whatever that will mean. The problem is that Russia and Iran are supposed to be partners in this fight. Regime change in Syria is not feasible as long as Russia unconditionally backs Assad. Iranian influence is growing in Iraq, but both Canada and the United States must continue to support the Iraq government, even under these very trying circumstances. 8, I don't know what the status of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is. When government change occurs, however, and this is my speculative judgment, when government change occurs, some change, perhaps passive change, in such policy arrangements is to be expected. Finally, 9th, funding cuts are taking place in the U.S. State Department and elsewhere in the U.S. government. It is only to be expected that mainline defense expenditures are likely to increase. Such cuts, the cuts I've talked about, are to be expected in the U.S. funding of some multilateral institutions. The question's about multilateral institutions. And all I would say is perhaps other democracies, especially those not meeting the 2% NATO defense spending threshold, will increase their level of funding of multilateral institutions. For those of us who know that they're important, will increase their funding of multilateral institutions in offsetting terms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Doran, we'll go to Mr. Hampson, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before your committee. I'm going to focus on NAFTA and the future of NAFTA. I'm not going to address all of the many questions that you did. They were done so ably by my good friend, Charles Duran. The first point I'd like to make is that, in my view, the Trump administration is going to use the North American Free Trade Agreement negotiations as part of a larger strategic initiative to set the tone with U.S. trading partners where there is a real trade imbalance, namely China and Germany. There's an old Chinese expression, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And I think that's exactly what they're trying to do, and we've seen that in Korea's response to what they've seen happening in some of the statements the president has made about NAFTA. I think it's entirely consistent with NAFTA's origins, which set both the tone and substance of America's subsequent trade liberalization policies globally. Only this time, President Trump is throwing America's trade policies into reverse gear. The pressures, as we know, that we're seeing now did not begin with Donald Trump. Softwood lumber is a perennial irritant. So has dairy, beef, and pork. Domestic pressures in the U.S. on trade have been building up for a very long period of time. Those of you with long memories will remember Ross Perot's candidacy for the presidency in the previous century. At first blush, the balance of power in negotiations between Canada and the United States appears to be highly asymmetrical. They're the bigger economy by many orders of magnitude. They're also far less dependent on trade for economic growth than we are. Although trade is a two-way street, and the balance, as Professor Duran pointed out, is currently in the U.S. favor, and even more so if you remove energy from the equation, and we're right to remind Americans of the facts. As we've seen, facts are not necessarily a winner when you talk to the current administration. As we look to the future of negotiations, the real question is, what is going to be our negotiating strategy? And there, I would make 3 points. First, we have to recognize that the status quo is unsustainable. We're going to have to make some concessions. The questions are over what and when. But we also need to define comparable benefits from the U.S. In any negotiation, you don't give up something without getting something in return. Third, we're playing with a weaker hand, but if we're smart negotiators, we can level the playing field and advance our interests. A long history of negotiating with the U.S. shows that Americans will negotiate with unannounced shifts in their position. You may remember the Nixon trade shocks of 1971. There will be unexplained and sudden escalation of demands. That was the story in both the NAFTA and the TPP negotiations. They will violate previous understandings or promises. That was certainly the case with NAFTA dispute provisions. And they will use excessive pressure and threats and will make demands that are well beyond our concession range. Trump will negotiate no differently from his predecessors, although the big difference is that Ronald Reagan, both Bushes, and Bill Clinton were pro-trade. Trump is a nationalist mercantilist. Our negotiating strategy should contain 5 key elements. Be clear about our own interests and what we want out of the negotiations. Second, be prepared to play a strong offense-defense game. Negotiations are not about being nice. Third, don't rush into talks until U.S. and Mexican objectives are clear. They're not clear right now. Fourth, exploit real cleavages that exist within the administration and between the administration and Congress to our advantage. Fifth, use selective retaliation only as a last resort because of the dangers of escalation. I would also say that wait and see is not a bad negotiating strategy at the outset. The administration is clearly divided between trade hawks such as Steve Bannon and more moderate voices, the so-called Goldman Sachs crowd, which includes Gary Cohn, the president's national economic advisor, whose star is rising. Cohn has made it clear he does not want a trade war with America's NAFTA partners. The administration is also not trusted by Congress, and it has yet to lay out its goals for trade talks. To get fast-track authority on trade pacts, including revisions to NAFTA, Trump will have to give Congress a 90 days notice. And that includes laying out the administration's goals and undertaking consultations with both the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, which have jurisdiction over trade. President Trump does not have full authority to do anything positive or negative on trade without approval from Congress. His rhetoric and that of Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton polluted attitudes in American and in Congress about trade, and that is the real problem for trade globally. I also think Trump is looking for a quick fix to NAFTA, as his other domestic initiatives stall. He's going to become more desperate to deliver on something, and the easiest fix, quite frankly, would be to backfill NAFTA with some of the key provisions that were negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, including improved standards for labor, environment, and e-commerce, and policies that eliminate export subsidies for agriculture. The fact that Trump is in a hurry to make a deal, and that has also been said quite vocally by his Commerce Secretary, that works to our advantage because we can run down the clock. Furthermore, if delay or avoidance tactics on our part fail, we can also reduce the content and scope of any compromises we make as we run down the clock. And that may mean conceding on some items that, quite frankly, are less important to the trade equation, such as, for example, dairy subsidies. In the early stages of negotiation, we should avoid making explicit pledges and be sufficiently ambiguous until we have carefully reviewed and assessed both Washington and Mexico City's proposals. Although we're focused on trade, and I'd just like to touch on something that Professor Durand mentioned, it's important not to lose sight of the bigger picture and where the U.S. appears to be going with its taxation and industrial policies. Our corporate tax regime has been very competitive vis-a-vis the United States. That may change. We're talking about raising our corporate taxes. Trump wants to lower theirs and has already introduced a proposal to lower taxes for individually owned businesses. U.S. carbon policy, at least at the federal level, is doing a 180 from the policies of the Obama administration. Deregulation is the mantra of the day. Right-to-work legislation in some states has become a magnet for manufacturing and foreign investment. The more we are out of sync with U.S. policies at both the national and state levels, the less competitive and attractive a destination Canada will be for investment, and our core competitive advantage will evaporate. Although Canada is working very hard under the current government to diversify its trade and investment ties with other countries, like those in the Asia-Pacific and the recently concluded CETA agreement, those policies of diversification will only work if they're based on a healthy core, namely our open border and trading relationship with the United States. Finally, we should also look to non-trade issues that we can use to advantage to underscore our broader strategic importance to the United States, especially at a time when national security is paramount to Americans. That may mean buying the F-35s and ramping up our military spending. We ignore the importance of defense and security in our bilateral relationship at our peril, and I would simply like to underscore what Professor Durand has said on that point. But at all times, as we look forward to the negotiations that are soon going to start, we must also be ready to conclude that no deal is better than a bad deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hampson. Colleagues, now we'll go to questions. We'll start with Mr. Allison, please.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for both being here. And Mr. Hampson, it's glad to have you back at committee again. So, Mike, so little time and so many questions in terms of both your presentations. Mr. Durand, you talked about the fact that maybe Mr. Hampson, you talked about how important NAFTA is, but you also talked, Mr. Dorner, about the fact that maybe there's some bigger things at play in terms of China, et cetera, et cetera. So our thoughts are, my question is that as we look at some of these things, and we talk about NAFTA and trade, for example, I mean, I know we talk about supply management, we talk about some of these irritants, softwood lumber, but I mean, the reality is that the U.S. subsidizes their agriculture like crazy as well, and that never seems to be the question. And so, you know, we talk about giving up something, and whether it's softwood. I mean, they've taken us 4 times to the WTA. We've won every time. We've solved these issues. My question is, and both of you talked about raising defense spending as an example. Is that part of the negotiation process? If we look at, you know, the overall picture of NAFTA, maybe part of it saying, listen, we're going to commit to spending more in defense or whatever the case is, versus just sort of, like, I think it's a false argument. We say we're going to give up supply management so we can do better on softwood lumber, because my question is, you know, what about all the other things and the things that they actually subsidize as well? So.
Well, first of all, I agree with you that there's subsidies everywhere. I know a bit about agriculture, having grown up on a farm and still owning one. Agriculture is a complicated mess in terms of government policy on both sides of the border. So I don't know what you do or can do or want to do about that. I would just say that, again, I don't believe that Washington thinks the major problems in trade lie with Canada. They know the size of the trading relationship. They know this, but they want to show that they're going to be even-handed, quote. So they're even tough on their friends. You know, you said, well, what about other things coming in? In the past, it was kind of a no-no to do this linkage across issues, especially with the United States, because that brings in the Congress, and you just can't do cross-linkage with Congress. I'm sure you have similar experiences here. So, so that's it. But this administration likes to do deals, or thinks that we can do deals. And I saw the interaction with the Chinese, and it was public knowledge that when Mr. Xi left Washington after the recent visit, there was some really serious discussion that went on. And it was said that if China could see fit to help us with North Korea, the trade negotiations would go a lot more easily. How much more clear can one be? I don't know if there are going to be explicit linkages. I think that's a disaster. But implicit relationships, you know, winks and nods about what we're going to do elsewhere, that is all part of this relationship, without any question. The difficulty, of course, is knowing how does the other side actually weight things and value things. And that is the art of negotiation.
So I think a core proposition is you don't give up anything unless you get something in return. And so if we're going to come under pressure to make concessions on dairy, which the president singled out when he was visiting Wisconsin for reasons that still remain perhaps inexplicable, you know, we got asked for something in return. And it could be in the agricultural sector. I mean, the most heavily subsidized agricultural sector in the world is the U.S. agricultural sector. I mean, we all know that.
Have you been to Switzerland recently?
Well, it's there's competition, but you know, they are playing the same game, and I think you know, that can be a basis for you know, for negotiation. The problem with softwood lumber is that it hasn't been. It's not part of NAFTA, as we know, and that's an issue that has to be, I think, dealt with on its own, and we have to get our own act together. I mean, the difficulty our own government faced in the most recent discussions on softwood lumber is that our own industry is not united, and you need to at least have a common position if you're going forward in a negotiation. Otherwise, the other side will tear you apart. When it comes to linkage tactics, you know, trade for defense, I wouldn't go there. It's I think it's fair to say, the history of our relationship with the United States is that we deal with issues on a discrete basis. We don't play linkage tactics because, quite frankly, they'll work against us. Having said that, if they want to get into a discussion about procurement and Buy American, we shouldn't hesitate to say, look, we have a defense industrial sharing agreement with you that goes back many, many years. And we're buying a lot from you when it comes to defense goods, and they're, potentially major purchases coming down the pike. So you better look at your broader interests.
One more quick question. I know there's no easy answer to this one. Mr. Duran, you talked about North Korea a bit. How, it seems like this administration is prepared to act more than any other administration. What are your thoughts on what's going to happen as you look into your crystal ball on North Korea and Mr. Trump?
Well, I don't have any great sources of information. I just read the press very, very carefully and listen to lots of people. But my judgment is that it's not just the Trump administration. It's everybody who seriously looks at defense recognizes that North Korea is going to be a problem. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And I think the sense in Washington is that the people who really have influence over North Korea are the Chinese. But because the Chinese have that influence, they know they have leverage over us, so they don't do anything. And their interests are not to do anything because they fear that the North might collapse and they'd have problems with that, or the North or the South would be united with a South Korean type of regime, and that would be a threat to them. So they have all kinds of things they can bring to the table that concern them. What I think they should be thinking about is this. If they do nothing, the North Koreans are going to have nuclear weapons and missiles. Sometimes say they'll probably aim at San Francisco and end up hitting Los Angeles. But in any case, they'll get something, or maybe Vancouver, but they'll get something over here. And that is absolutely new and very problematic. So I think what's going to happen is that the North Koreans are going to have to cease and desist, and the Chinese, as I said, have been reluctant, but they seem to be much more open to possibilities. What that really meant is using sanctions against the North. I have to tell you, I do not underestimate the firmness of resolve of the Trump administration. And if you have any doubts about that, then look at the man he chose for defense secretary. Sorry, wrong country. For defense secretary, not defense minister, defense secretary. In any case, Mattis is a very serious soldier.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. I'll go to Mr. Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for sharing your experience with us this morning. I'm from BC, so I have to touch the softwood lumber issue. Dr. Hampson, you touched on that issue there. As we all aware that recently Mr. Trump announced his intention to countervailing duty of 24% on any lumber going from our country to his. Whereas the previous administration raised these kind of issues discreetly, but President Trump's approach, condemning Canada, criticizing Canada publicly, the negotiations are still going behind the closed curtain. How would it impact the negotiators, since the demand command from the president is very strongly condemning? At the same time, negotiator going in to a room prepared, not knowing the climate is so uncertain. So how would it pan out in your view?
During the election campaign, and it may have gone unnoticed in Canada, but I was scouring through then presidential candidate Trump's speeches, and he gave a speech within, I think, 13 or 15 kilometers of the Canadian border when he was in the state of Washington, where he didn't mention Canada by name, but he talked about the softwood lumber issue. So it was clearly in his sights. And we have, as I mentioned in my remarks, this has been a long-standing perennial. He has chosen to play hardball. I think our biggest challenge, quite frankly, is to mobilize a core constituency in the United States, namely the home builders associations, because taxing imports is going to raise the costs of construction in the United States. And they have been, in the past, important allies for us. I think it's fair to say we haven't heard a whole lot from them on this issue. A second point I would make is that the economics of the lumber industry, particularly if you look at southern pine in the United States, works against us because their sources of production are very close to market. Our sources of production are far from market. They're major transportation costs, even once you've got the trees down, to bring them south to market. And that's partly why we have the sort of stumpage fee arrangements that we do. But having said that, I think as we negotiate the future of softwood lumber, it's going to be absolutely critical, and this is true more generally with NAFTA, that we mobilize key sectors of the industry that are sympathetic to us, and do what we've done in the past, which is build a transnational constituency to promote our interests.
Any different take, Professor?
Well, I think that Professor Hampson has outlined the difficulties. I would just mention one thing. The tariff, as I understand it, varies with the province and with the costs. So there's quite a range. I think it's certainly the case that the average citizen is going to suffer from this arrangement. The average house might cost $2,000 more because of this arrangement. But I would just urge caution on what we've described as mobilization. I remember in an earlier period when we were talking about the acid precipitation, in other words, acid rain, and there was a sense that that public diplomacy would be a good idea, and in fact, the then Canadian ambassador, who ultimately became one of the great ambassadors, but was still in the learning phase, said what Canada should do is to advertise on radio how much damage acid rain was doing. This was in New England in particular. Of course, it's true. It was doing great damage there. But the response he got was exactly the opposite of what was anticipated, because these stiff-necked New Englanders said, the Canadians are going to tell us what our problems are? We know what our problems are. Why are they telling us this? So there's an absolute reaction against this, and they quickly dropped the so-called public diplomacy approach. So, you have to, there are probably ways of doing it effectively, but there's certainly a lot of ways of doing it without effectiveness.
Hey, let's talk about the foreign policy. Lately, Mr. Trump was engaging in a flurry of foreign policy ventures, attack in Syria, warship in Korea's peninsula, talking to Russia and China, trying to mediate problems in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. What do you make out of this? you think this hard power will prove to be effective at the end of the day?
If you have it, you can't conceal it. And if you conceal it, you're going to, in fact, underplay your hand. So it doesn't mean you have to use it, but it has to mean that people have to know that it exists. Look at the response to the situation in Syria. Mr. Trump was rightly appalled by the use of sarin gas, the death of babies, the pain that they went through. He's very articulate. He explained that very well. And they decided to, on very short notice, to launch 59 missiles out of the Mediterranean. But they, in fact, in the process, did this. And I should say photographic evidence suggests that 57 missiles hit their targets. But they warned the Russians in advance that this was going to happen. And they knew the Russians would inform the Syrians in advance. And I know that the Turks had already known about this 20 minutes before it took place. So this is general knowledge. Unfortunately, there were a few civilians who weren't informed. So what was the purpose of all this? Well, the purpose was to say hard power does exist. And I think it suggests to Mr. Assad that if he tries to use this again, who knows, maybe the palace will be the next target. And I think also the message got through to North Korea that the capacity to knock out those facilities they have to quite a high degree exists. And China understood this very, very well. You know, this was announced in the middle of a luncheon meeting with the Chinese president. Now, you people are professionals. You understand the symbolism of that.
I thought it was dinner.
Yeah, it probably was lunch, dinner, something like that. So the effect of that is not lost. And I think that this, in the matters you're talking about here, high politics among the great powers, I think that Russia and China take Trump seriously, partly because they don't quite know what he's going to do.
I'm going to go have a chair, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et je vais...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, gentlemen, for your very interesting presentations. Professor Hampson, I'd like to get back to something you spoke of. What is at stake for us in a probable renegotiation of NAFTA? And I was also thinking of the problems between the U.S. and Mexico, but to what extent can Canada work with Mexico to avoid, how can I put it, to avoid face-to-face negotiations each time? Do you have any comments?
Very much for your question. This is a trilateral negotiation that is going to take place, but I think we should be under no illusions that it's going to have its own bilateral elements to it. And the Americans, as quite frankly they did with NAFTA, will try to play us off against the Mexicans. And what's different is that Canada's relationship with Mexico has changed quite dramatically since the origins of NAFTA. They're now our third most important trading partner, and that has to do with the nature of North American value chains. We're a major investor in Mexico. We did a study at CG that showed that there's some 3,000 Canadian companies that are doing business in Mexico. It's an important destination for tourists. The reverse flow of Mexican investment in Canada is small, but it's also beginning to change. Bimbo, which is a bread manufacturing company, has set up operations in Canada. And I suspect as the Mexican economy matures, there's likely to be more investment. And that is to say is that Canada, the United States, and Mexico have a real interest in maintaining open supply chains across our respective borders. And that's particularly true in the automobile sector. However, there are some differences. Trump has made no secret of the fact that he wants to have tighter content rules of origin, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and his target there is automobiles. And Mexico has a bigger problem than we do because the Chinese have been using Mexico as a beachhead to and exploiting those supply chains, to their own commercial advantage, which is a perfectly rational thing to do. Whereas when it comes to Canada, we're pretty much in alignment with the U.S. on that issue. So I think that's going to be a pretty contentious issue. I think we will have common interests with the Mexicans on some issues. That would certainly be true when it comes to energy, for example, free flow of energy and investment in the energy sector. Also true, I would say, in the area of agriculture. But on an issue like migration, which is very contentious, our interests are quite different from the Mexicans. So, I think it's going to be a mixed approach. We join hands with the Mexicans when it suits us, and quite frankly, when it suits them. The Mexicans, by the way, don't need lessons in negotiations from Canadians. They've shown, as we saw in the trucking incident some years ago, that they can play real hardball, and they're very effective at mobilizing supportive constituencies in the southern border states in the United States to their advantage. So I think, are we going to be in lockstep with them? No. But does that mean it's divide and conquer when it comes to dealing with the Americans? No.
Could I just add a footnote? I think that it may happen that Canada is going to have to decide on some of these trade issues whether it wants to go along with some provisions which are, quite frankly, not first choices, but which would involve looking at North America as a true, united, integrated economy, or whether they'd like to go for their priorities, their preferences, and risk being locked out of a much more coherent and maybe in some cases protectionist American market. Well, those are tough choices. Those are tough choices, but I think that may happen.
Merci à tous les deux.
Thank you. Another question for both of you. As was mentioned, President Trump can't do very much without the agreement of Congress. And I'd like to know what you think about just where Congress stands. Because we intend to go to Washington, do you think that we here might be able to play a useful role?
I think everybody wants to know where Congress stands on certain issues. It's not unified, as we all know, and even the Republican Party is not unified. I think it's fair to say that there are many free traders. I mean, historically, the Republican Party has been the defender of free trade. And there's still those voices. We're hearing less about border adjustment taxes coming out of the Congress, but I would say that one is still not dead. And that would be enormously damaging. It's just, another way of talking about tariffs. I think stressing, obviously, mutual advantage, getting our numbers right in terms of, who really benefits, particularly in those northern tier states from an open trading relationship with Canada. We're doing a lot of that already. I mean, I think both the cabinet, the premiers, this really is Team Canada. It may not be Team Canada when it comes to the home game, but when it comes to the overseas or the cross-border game, it's Team Canada. And I think that has to continue. I think your meeting with your counterparts can be enormously beneficial, but that means going with a well-honed brief, clear message lines, a recognition that, yes, we can make the status quo better. We don't have to go backwards. We need to look forwards. And I'd just like to add, one of the areas where we should be looking forward is in the whole area of e-commerce. And that is where the growth of the middle class, to come back to your point about Mexico, there are huge opportunities that are going to emerge in Mexico in the whole e-commerce field as Mexicans get credit cards and start shopping online.
So we'll go to Mr. Sani, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming here today. I want to ask you a question, and I want to pick up on something you said, Professor. You talked about the timing, that it's in our best interest right now if the free trade negotiations happen quickly. And I wanted to get your commentary on one point, because logistically going through, let's say till July 2018, right now we have a situation where the president has not informed Congress. That will take 90 days. We also know that there's going to be a presidential election next year by July 2018. We also know that President Nino is not eligible to run. So my question is that logistically, there's a 90-day provision. Beyond that, you're going to get into a lame duck sort of presidency for the Mexican president. The domestic considerations in Mexico right now are not favorable towards the United States. How, over the next year, how are we going to get it done when we're going to have one partner? And I think that, from the commentary has been that there should be a trilateral agreement, that we should not do one-offs bilaterally. How would the timing work under these circumstances to do it before July 2018? Because if we're going to get a deal, it should be with the current president who is more favorable, the current Mexican president who's more favorable, as compared to delaying it beyond the election and allowing someone else to come in who may not be that favorable.
I think the real issue and the pace of the negotiation is going to obviously be driven by the Americans. And whether there will be a presidential election in Mexico, that may certainly stall things on the Mexican side. But I think the Americans, as the big trading partner, the elephant in the room, are going to drive the timetable. But there's a big question mark there, because Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, has said he wants a deal next year. He has also said he wants to revisit every single chapter of NAFTA. He's not going to be able to have it both ways. If he wants to revisit every single chapter of NAFTA, you're looking at a 3-year negotiation if you're lucky, right? And so they're going to have to make some tough choices. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think the president is looking for the quick fix. And that works to our advantage. It works to the Mexican advantage. They can play the clock too, not just with the Americans, but in the context of their own domestic political situation. So, and the quick fix means, going for some hits where we're willing to take a bit of pain, we're going to get something in return. And that would also be true on the Mexican side, so that Trump can say he's delivered, and we'll see the fate of the health care bill today, at least in the lower house. But he's not doing very well, and he's got to deliver on something.
Mr. Chairman, may I add a footnote? Sure. I see the plausibility of the argument that Professor Hampson is offering, and in the past, I think it would have been an absolutely clear and convincing position to take. But I'm not so sure that the new administration follows the same rules that existed before. And I would have to say that I'm not totally convinced that if the outcome was considered to be unfavorable to the United States, that they wouldn't say, okay, it's over. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't be revisited. It doesn't mean that there wouldn't be all kinds of interesting things that would happen. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be extremely damaging to existing supply chains and so on. But I think the assumption that the United States is just sort of going to be boxed into a corner because of time might not be something you want to test.
More time?
Mr. Sani, one more question?
One more question? Just for your final comment, and this is something, Professor Duran, you mentioned about revisiting every chapter, and rules of origin is something that's a bit complex. In terms of, you mentioned the Chinese integrating themselves into the supply chain through Mexico. So,
That. Give him credit where credit's due.
So you're talking about trade deflection, and there's also the other policy of cross accumulation of making sure trade is much better. So if we are going to enter these negotiations, we have two options. The one option could be to create one whole market between the three countries and have the same external tariffs that would make it easier for companies to do business in this, because sometimes with the onerous obligations under NAFTA, or it's probably easier to become, deal with the most favored trade nation status. Do you think that's a much better or much more efficient approach to prevent trade deflection and to, have a better policy with cross accumulation?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. There's concern that I've perceived about the way in which NAFTA could be exploited by outside trading partners in a way which the biggest market would feel would be at its disadvantage. So I think that's the right thing to look at. And I frankly don't know how great the problem is. So one should look at it and see if it really is serious. And if it is that serious, then there are going to have to be some remedies. And maybe the remedies you're talking about are the ones that should be looked at. Certainly would be some of them that should be considered. I think that kind of openness, the openness you're talking about, the flexibility, the willingness to consider all other alternatives, to see where real problems exist and to try to deal with them, that's important. I would just say this. My perception of this government is that it is very concerned about non-tariff barriers, wherever they occur, and particularly they occur in Asia. But insofar as we're discussing NAFTA, that would be looked at as well. And what are non-tariff barriers? Well, I don't know. There are all kinds of things, everything from regulations to fiscal policy to a host of things. But what one should recognize is that these people are business people. They're not academics. They're not theorists. They're solid business people. And some of them are in businesses that are having a pretty rough time. And I'm not sure the solutions are out there for what I looked at the difference between the labor costs between China and the United States and Canada. Wow. They're enormous. How are you going to deal with all of that? You see, that's the kind of thing they're trying to grapple with, and try to figure out a way to sort of level the field and they want to bring business back into North America, including manufacturing business. Let me just give you an example of how earnest they are. A study was done recently by Professor Blinder at Princeton a labor economist. And in it, he argued that in the near future, 40 million jobs by base of his analysis models, 40 million jobs in the service industries, as far as the United States are concerned, are going to be offshored. So it's not just the Trump people who are concerned about this. A lot of other folks are too. I know you are. The openness you're suggesting of looking for solutions, that's really what has to happen here, I think.
Mr. Sadi and Mr. Doran and Mr. Hampson. As always, there's not enough time to get into this. We could spend a few more hours sitting here with you, but it's been a very good start. We do welcome further discussion vis-a-vis reports, ideas, things that you're hearing that the Foreign Affairs Committee would be pleased to know about. This is a long-term discussion we're going to have at this committee because it's, as you might imagine, a very important part of Canada's relationship abroad. So again, thank you very much for your presentations and the time you spent with us. Colleagues, we're going to take a short break for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get right back to our next witnesses. So suspend for 2 minutes. Bring this meeting back to order. Is Mr. Black on?
He hasn't arrived at the video conferencing center yet, so as soon as he gets there, they'll put them on. I'm trying to put them down.
This meeting is back in session. First of all, I just wanted to, I understand we have students from the Havergal College. Welcome. Got to get the name right. That's the first thing. And they're here to listen into our committee's deliberations. So welcome to the committee. Secondly, we're going to get right into the individuals who will be making presentations for us. And for the Canadian American Business Council, that's Mary Scott Greenwood, who is the Chief Executive Officer. So welcome to Ms. Greenwood. She's here. We're just waiting for Conrad Black to get to the video conferencing center. I understand he's on his way. So we're going to start with Ms. Greenwood's presentation, and then we'll hook in with Mr. Black at some point here in the next number of minutes, hopefully. So with no further ado, we're going to go straight to Ms. Greenwood, and then we'll get into questions with her, and hopefully Mr. Black will come on screen. So, Ms. Greenwood, please.
Merci, bonjour tout le monde. Il est un grand plaisir.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
For the invitation to appear before you on behalf of the members of the Canadian American Business Council. I am here from Washington, and I'm actually from Washington. So I represent the swamp, which apparently is currently being drained, and we can talk all about that and talk about our role in that. It is certainly an interesting time to be focused on Canada-U.S. policy matters and more broadly on the common ground and uncommon friendship that we have long shared, a hallmark of the enduring, affectionate, productive relationship between Canada and the United States. In the first 100 days since President Donald Trump's inauguration, he has walked back several key campaign promises. You heard a little bit about that from the professors earlier today, and I will just underscore and elaborate. The president decided not to call out China as a currency manipulator. He opted not to lift sanctions on Russia. He decided against moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He chose not to abandon decades of U.S. policy on China and Taiwan with the so-called one China policy. He decided not to walk away from the Iran nuclear agreement, not to close the Exim Bank, not to upend President Obama's diplomatic outreach to Cuba. The president even did an about-face on his isolationist, non-intervention rhetoric by enforcing President Barack Obama's red line on Syria with a missile strike in response to atrocities perpetuated by the Assad regime. Due to all the reversals, supporters of the North American Free Trade Agreement, like us, took note, and the president, in a similar fashion, as you well know here, decided against his recent threat to tear up NAFTA. But it is far too soon to breathe a sigh of relief on any of these issues. The 45th President of the United States has demonstrated repeatedly that he is nothing if not unpredictable. For now, the U.S. is not pulling out of NAFTA. However, it is planning, as you know, and why we're all here, I suppose, planning a significant renegotiation. NAFTA is, after all, a 23-year-old three-year-old trade agreement negotiated during an entirely different era. It was enacted when a lot of people had yet to log on to the internet. The iPhone was more than a decade away. Some of the biggest and most robust sectors of the North American economy did not exist when NAFTA was negotiated. It is in legitimate need of an update. Now that the conditions seem right for a new NAFTA, the Canadian American Business Council, the organization that I represent, has come up with a list of top 10 suggestions on how to grow the Canada-U.S. economy by giving NAFTA a shot in the arm. We refer here strictly to the bilateral Canada-U.S. relationship, although we do see merit in a trilateral negotiation. I'm not sure the politics are there to have a full-on trilateral negotiation, as desirable as that would be. So if there are 2 or 3 bilaterals, U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico, Canada-Mexico, so be it. So here are our recommendations. The first one is simple. Create a chapter in NAFTA on regulatory cooperation that codifies and strengthens the Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council as a permanent entity. The fruits of that bilateral labor are frustratingly slow at the moment, yet they're integral to the health of both economies since they'll eliminate costly red tape by harmonizing regulations on both sides of the border. Later today, in front of another committee, I'll be talking about specific recommendations on regulatory cohesion. So I know you'll want to tune in for that. It'd be spellbinding for sure. Formally recognizing RCC in a new NAFTA would ensure that the governments work in tandem on new regulations that align existing regulations. There's also, I would add, an argument to be made in favor of a, quote, negative list approach to new regulations. Such an approach would deem that all new regulations are harmonized. Everything is just deemed harmonized, Canada-U.S., unless you set it aside on a negative list. It's a pretty big idea, but we advocate for it. Our second recommendation is to mutually recognize voluntary product standards, testing, and certification, and implement zero tariffs on all products so that we truly have a free trade agreement. A question here in this committee was asked earlier on that. It's probably too much to hope that dairy and lumber would be included in the zero tariff regime. So for these sectors, we encourage new arrangements that are mutually acceptable. The swift resolution of the dairy and lumber disputes indeed constitute our third recommendation. Fourth, we advocate revamping the Buy American provisions into one Buy American Canadian requirement. Or, stated another way, consider Canada domestic for the purpose of U.S. procurement. There is a model for this. The 1956 Canada-U.S. Defense Production Sharing Agreement requires that Canadian suppliers are treated the same as U.S. suppliers for the purposes of procurement. We think that the reciprocity would need to be genuine with a level playing ground for both Canadian and American companies on each side of the border. Our fifth recommendation is to support further integration of our North American energy markets by building robust, interconnected infrastructure systems to connect supply and demand. That will require a push for predictable, efficient, expedited regulatory regimes to ensure cross-border infrastructure that's up and running in a timely fashion. This one seems self-evident, yet it's surprising how little coordination exists in an otherwise integrated electricity, energy, and transmission cross-border systems. Our sixth recommendation is to enhance the protection of intellectual property, including, but not limited to, exploring policy options in Canada to counteract judicial interpretations of IP rules which serve to invalidate long-standing patents, particularly in the life sciences sector. It is time for Canada's Parliament to fully explore legal options that in recent years have been left solely to the Canadian courts, to the serious detriment of innovation and foreign investment in Canada. We actually explore this issue, if you're interested in it, in a deep dive discussion on innovation policy in a paper on the Canadian American Business Council's website, and I'm happy to talk to you more at length about it if you want. The observation here is that it's a policy area that for a couple of decades has been interpreted by the courts, but the Parliament hasn't opined and hasn't set policy, and we think it's time for that. Number 7 involves the establishment of rules to promote and govern digital trade, including provisions prohibiting data localization and digital customs duties, enabling cross-border data and securing basic non-discrimination principles for digital products. 8th on our list is updating the rules governing the movement of people across our common border to reflect the modern categories of employment, including those that work in the digital economy. all of you have traveled back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border into the United States. Some of you have experienced some of the challenges with respect to crossing. It's time to update those lists and that collaboration. The 9th recommendation calls for enhancement and modernization of joint security arrangements to foster freer cross-border movement of goods, services, more reliable, predictable border crossings. Here I refer to a lot to pre-clearance legislation that the U.S. Congress passed and signed into law. I know the House of Commons here is considering it. I'll be back in a few weeks to another committee to talk about the importance of pre-clearance, but also delighted to talk to you about our perspective on how important that is, if you like. Finally, since the new NAFTA will potentially serve as a model for future agreements, the way its predecessor was, we suggest taking a stand against currency manipulation. It's not an issue, obviously, here in North America, but can pose a problem with other economies. Even if President Trump isn't willing to take China on at the moment, we think it's important. These 10 recommendations aren't easy, but they are possible, and if achieved, could provide a meaningful boost to the flow of commerce, the pace of trade, the health of the economies of both Canada and the United States, and Mexico, if it's part of it. They'd lead to minimal disruption and, in fact, would ease regulatory burdens on countless businesses, citizens, and industries on both sides of our common border. They'd cut costs and red tape. They'd open up lucrative new markets for those sectors that have existed under protectionist regimes for too long. We are headed into a dynamic new age of technological advances that are demanding the United States and Canada come together as partners like never before. These new advances are almost as unpredictable as the next 100 days of the Trump administration. In both instances, though, it is worth focusing on what needs updating in the NAFTA and to create a blueprint for how our countries can do business together for generations to come. I'd like to conclude by thanking you for having me. Thank you for having me on this particular day, May 4th. So I must end by saying, may the 4th be with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Greenwood. We've now been able to hook up Mr. Conrad Black, who I understand was delayed by an accident on his way to the conference center. So, Mr. Black, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so as normal practice in the committee, the witnesses are given an opportunity to make some opening comments. So Ms. Greenwood went first, and I understand you know each other, so we'd like to give you an opportunity to making opening comments, and then we'll go to questions from there. So the floor is yours.
In person, actually, only on TV.
I have to say that I wasn't aware that I was expected to make an opening comment. I can certainly improvise one, but it would be rather platitudinous, and I don't want to inflict that on the committee. Would it be a dereliction if we just did without an opening comment? Perhaps I could say something at the end. It's something of a mystery to me exactly what I'm supposed to do, but I'll do whatever you want, Mr. Chairman.
You endorse my comments, Mr. Black.
I only heard the latter part of them, Scotty, so I certainly agreed with what I heard, but you and I usually agreed when we debated on CTV, other than who we wanted and expected to win the election.
Right. Other than that.
We're always at the disposal of the witnesses as to how they want to present themselves. So, knowing Mr. Black as well as I do, having followed him for many years, I will take his lead, and I'm going to go straight to questions, and we'll start with Mr. Kamiec, please. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you both for being here today. We had two witnesses come in before and talk quite a great deal about NAFTA and some of the intricacies of renegotiating the agreement. But there's very little about the tax changes being proposed by the White House, by the Congress. It's unclear who's proposing what. And I know people talk about Trump as being unpredictable. I like to think of him as unconventional in his approach to the presidency and how he behaves and how his cabinet behaves. So the tax proposal, I'm always wondering, which is the greater risk to Canadian business? Is it the renegotiations with NAFTA and the 10 points that you mentioned, Ms. Greenwood? You kind of went through kind of a list of things that could be included, may want to be included as options. Or there's the tax reform, and I'm just looking through it here. It has things like simplifying the tax brackets on the personal side, the repeal of the inheritance tax, doubling the standard deduction, repealing the alternative minimum tax. It also has reducing the corporate tax rate to 15% from 35%, which is a $3.7 trillion initiative. that they have. It has to repeal the tax on investment income. They're also talking about expanding childcare benefits and then repealing the most deductions except for mortgages and charitable giving. The other one that concerns me is the one-time tax on overseas profits. That is not very clear what they want to do. So, to both of you, where should Canada actually be focused on? Is it on this NAFTA renegotiations? Should we be pushing the Americans to play their hand, or should we wait and focus on these tax changes they're proposing, which may actually go through much sooner and have a much greater impact on Canadian business?
Did you wish me to speak?
Yes, sir.
Well, I do not consider myself completely qualified to offer advice on the tactics of which to do. I assume we can prepare for both at the same time, but I did say in my remarks with Scotty coming up to the election and between the election and the inauguration that Trump should be taken at his word. He intends to do what he said, and well, some find him unpredictable. I don't. I think he is quite predictable, and he is going to enact his program. It appears that he will get a modified health care bill, at least through the House today. Obviously, it'll have to be reconciled with the Senate, and that doesn't get it done. But that ties into the tax bill. And I think on the matters you mentioned, my guess, for what it's worth, is that he is going to have to produce some revenue enhancement to accompany these tax reductions. And the one that he has mentioned, the president himself has mentioned, is in effect to take the anticipated decline in the gasoline price and instead of giving that decline to the consumers, putting what amounts to an additional tax on gasoline, but not one that raises the price from where it is now. It is assumed in the administration that over time the price of gasoline in the United States will come down because of offshore drilling and increased fracking and a reduction of imports. The other that has been floating around and is the one that occasionally I inflict upon my American readers in the National Review is a tax on elective spending, not unavoidable spending such as groceries or children's clothing, but luxury spending or fair swath of financial transactions. And to the extent that impinges upon Wall Street, this president doesn't owe Wall Street anything anyway, and it has done nothing but criticize him, but he can make it up to them by rolling back excessive regulation. Sarbanes-Oxley, and I suspect something like that will be worked out. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, because it is so complicated and the atmosphere is so poisonous. As you know, Mr. Trump ran for president running against all factions of both parties. He ran against the Bushes as much as the Clintons and the Obamas. He ran against Wall Street, Hollywood, almost all the media, most of academia, the entire bureaucracy, and virtually every adult in Washington, D.C., 94% of whose voters voted against him. But he did win, but the war continues. But it is going to have to de-escalate at some point, and if he gets some sort of health care measure through, it may be a signal that finally 20 years of gridlock in that system is breaking down. And my own view is that the Democrats cannot go on trying to stigmatize him as a madman, a lunatic, an illegitimate person who provokes, in the words of one of the New York Times columnists, Mr. Christoph, a whiff of treason. They just can't go on with this. And Colbert's outrageous comments on Monday night. And there will be a settling down. And so we will get back to relatively normal government, though given the identity of the personalities, and particularly the president, rather flamboyant government. But on your question, I think over time, the tax question is going to be a bigger one because I leave it to you legislators and wouldn't presume to advise you on this point, but the implications to Canada of declining energy prices and a sharply lower corporate tax. I doubt if it'll get down to 15%, as the president suggested last week. I imagine you have to compromise a little above that. But the implications of that to Canada are clearly serious in terms of where international investment money is apt to go to get into this North American market. I'm not a trade wonk, and I don't want to get out of my depth, but I take the president at his word that his his desires in respect of adjustments of trade arrangements with Canada are relatively minor. He has never expressed to me the slightest grievance against Canada other than on the matter of its failure to live up to the 2% target for defense spending as a percentage of GDP amongst NATO countries. And for what it's worth, my information is that they considered the latest budgetary estimates from our government on that subject to be rather disappointing, but I'm sure those matters are dealt with in official channels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for the question, which was about, is tax reform more important to the Canada-U.S. relationship and Canadian competitiveness, I believe, than NAFTA? I think it's a very important question and a very smart question to ask. To set a little bit of context, you know, the President campaigned on repealing NAFTA and taking the United States out of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The congressional response to that, if you will, the congressional Republicans, while they didn't like NAFTA, they thought a better way to deal with these issues would be through tax reform. So you see, as you outlined in the question quite rightly, a whole series of proposed measures coming from the House Republican leadership on tax reform that they intended to incentivize exports and disincentivize imports, to try to get more companies to create things to manufacture here in the United States and then sell them abroad. So that was the policy reaction, because Congress really doesn't want a tough vote on NAFTA. They would rather deal with a multitude of things through tax reform, including trade policy. So that's sort of the context. The border adjustment tax being a way, instead of renegotiating NAFTA, maybe we could do that, was the thinking of Chairman Brady and Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and the House Republican leadership. We haven't had comprehensive tax reform in the United States since 1985. Think about where you might have been in 1985. That's a long time ago. And it looks like the president is intent on some kind of tax policy reform, but what form it takes, what it looks like, is going to be the subject of massive internal discussion in the United States. On border adjustability, for example, you didn't point to that, but it's related. You have whole coalitions in the United States of companies and interest groups that are for a big border adjustment tax because they're mostly exporters. And then you have people connected, companies and stakeholders that are really connected to the global supply chain and to the North American supply chain that think a border adjustability would be a disaster. So the politics are quite divided in the United States, and I think you rightly point out that if the U.S. succeeds in lowering the corporate tax rate to a level that's closer to what Canada has, which is relatively lower. Canada enjoys a very good economic competitive position for lots of reasons, and the tax rate is one of them. So if the U.S. gets closer to that, that presents a challenge to Canada for sure. I know the Business Council of Canada and other groups here are looking at that, looking at Canadian competitiveness in light of potential tax reform. You talked about the one-time repatriation of foreign proceeds. That is definitely something that sticks in the craw, if you will, of a lot of U.S. policymakers, because you've seen the phenomenon of inversions, where a company will leave the United States, move its corporate headquarters elsewhere to benefit, which is a legal thing to do, but it's not a patriotic thing to do, if you will, to benefit from the relative discrepancy in tax policy. So there is definitely an appetite to deal with all of those things. If the United States is successful in lowering the corporate tax rate, in incentivizing exports over imports, in putting in preferences on procurement for buy and hire American, that presents a very, very important challenge to Canada, to Canadian businesses, and to those of us that are really interested in the integrated nature of the Canada-U.S. economy.
Thank you, Mr. Kimyich. We're now going to go to Mr. McKay, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of you for appearing today. I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but from time to time I do read Mr. Black's articles, and occasionally I've even supplemented his bank account with a purchase of a book. I have...
And I have to debate him on TV.
I say.
Yeah.
I have been known to also take the newspaper and fling it against the wall with some concern. But whatever else, what I do notice in the writings of Mr. Black is that you are internally consistent, that there is a framework within which you write and within which you think. I, however, have not been able to determine any internal consistency with President Trump. He blows hot and cold on NATO. He blows hot and cold on Russia. He blows hot and cold on Putin, blows hot and cold. The only consistency seems to be his inconsistency. The problem with that is when you are trying to negotiate someone who is inconsistent and for whom there does not appear to be a set of values other than I win and you lose, it makes it difficult to approach negotiations. So your latest writings seem to hold out the contrary view to that, and I'd be interested in your expanding why you think that President Trump is actually far more consistent than maybe the rest of us can perceive.
Yeah, and Mr. McKay, I agree that it is difficult to perceive that, but I do believe it to be true on the basis of my experiences with him. We had him as a business partner in Chicago, where we owned the Sun-Times newspaper there. And I don't know if the committee knows that city well, but we had a low-rise building right downtown, right behind the Wrigley building and near the Tribune Tower. So it was a prime development land right on the Chicago River. And we put it out for bids, and his bid won. And my American directors, very eminent group, Dr. Kissinger and others, said, hang on to your wallet, he's a scoundrel, and so forth. And we were very careful, but he did engage even then in the sort of tactical maneuvering that you referred to, and he would take outrageous positions opposite certain contractors and the building trades unions, and negotiating zoning changes with the municipal government, which is, the Democratic Party has been in power in that city since 1929, so they're pretty well entrenched. And the ethical standards, both politically and in the building trades unions in Chicago, are not the highest I've ever seen. And his techniques are extremely aggressive, subject to apparent change, but always towards an unchanging purpose, which you summarized well, that he'll get a good deal for himself. In this case, we were on the same side, and he was negotiating for both of us, and he did a very, very good job. He came in exactly on budget, exactly on time. Though it's a rough city, Chicago's proud of its architectural heritage, the city of Frank Lloyd Wright and so on, and he produced a design that was very widely admired, and he had it filled with absolutely top-grade tenants well before it opened. So it was just completely successful. Now, that obviously is no guide to how he's going to negotiate with North Korea or Canada, but maybe it is partly a guide. And my impression of him is that he doesn't change his views as much as one thinks, but he does alter the mood and the ambience according to the level of his pleasure or displeasure with the other side. Some of it is preparatory, just flustering people and muddying the waters before substantive negotiations begin. And some of it is just agitating for the purpose of keeping the people he's negotiating with off balance. But he doesn't move around in terms of what he wants that much, and I don't think he has, particularly with Putin or the Chinese. I think he's made it quite clear that relations, pardon me, with China have been altered somewhat because the aggressive nuclear development of the North Koreans has moved that issue up well above any other that could be contentious between the United States and China, and he quite properly responds to events, and that takes precedence over whatever reservations the United States might have about for example, monetary policy in China. In the case of the Russians, it was always nonsense that he was particularly involved in any collusion with the Russians. The allegation that there was any Russian collusion with the Trump campaign is absolute bunk and will come down, as I wrote in the National Review earlier this week, it'll come down around the heads of the Democrats like a toilet seat. But the fact is he recognizes Russia as a eminent nationality, but he does not recognize it as anything like the force that it was when it was the Soviet Union with more than twice its population, military parity roughly with the United States, and the vast communist espionage and agitprop apparatus all around the world. But he believes it has to be treated not as a pariah, but as one of the world's important countries. And my guess is, for what it's worth, that the best indicator we've had of what can be done between those countries was in the meeting that took place in early March between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Russia, Turkey, and the United States. And the plan clearly was to make Turkey the incumbent power in the Middle East, recognized by the Americans and the Russians, and to replace and reduce Iranian influence. And the American goal would be to act on the fact that it can offer a great deal more to Russia than its alliance with Iran does, and that there is not any great natural disagreement now between Russia and the United States, and what is needed in Syria is some kind of confederation where Assad runs the Alawite part of it and some others, and the Western-sponsored protégés there have autonomy, and the 4 million displaced Syrians can be relocated durably. And in Ukraine, it appears that what might happen is that the Americans would be prepared to acquiesce in the resumption of Crimea by Russia, which had it up until 1955, but the Russians would have to stop meddling in irredentist affairs in Ukraine and the Baltic states, and in exchange for that, the U.S. would relax the sanctions. Now, that appears to be, it's my intuition, but not a completely uninformed intuition, that that's where they're headed. But there's no inconsistency in that, and the interruption with the air raid on Syria, the firing of the 59 cruise missiles was a specific point indicating that the U.S. simply would not tolerate the continued use of sarin gas on civilians in Syria after the Russians purported with the Syrians to have removed all such gas from Syria. But my answer, I'm sorry to be so loquacious, but my answer is I wouldn't be overly preoccupied with the atmospherics. He has his techniques, but he is not all over the map. He knows what he wants, and he's quite good at getting what he wants. And his theatrics should be, they are often entertaining, and they can be appreciated for that, but they're just tactics. I mean, what he wants is
you
what
covered.
he says he
You
wants.
covered quite a waterfront there, and let me just zero in on one element, and that is the apparent new relationship between Turkey and Russia, and also Mr. Trump's conversations with Erdogan. Is it your view, therefore, that Turkey that between them, Russia and the United States have nominated Turkey as the new big player in the Middle East? And in the Middle East, there's no action that doesn't go unreciprocated in some way or another. So where does that leave Iran?
Mr. Trump, I'll just, or Mr. Trump. That's not very good, is it, Mr. Black? I was thinking of Mr. Trump. I'm going to leave it at that because Mr. McKay's time's up, and I want to make sure other members get into this discussion, including Ms. Greenwood. So I'll go to Hélène Lavadière, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, or rather, thank you, sir, and thank you, madam, for being here today. I think, Ms. Greenwood, I'd like to have a copy, or we'd like to have a copy of your presentation, because you really go into all the issues that President Trump has gone backwards on. In your presentation, or the issues President Trump has backtracked on, the present political situation doesn't really allow us to envisage trilateral negotiations among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Although you believe that a trilateral negotiation would be best. Now, I want to make sure I understood you and let you go into this point a little more in detail.
Merci beaucoup for the question. I'll answer in English, unfortunately. So just to be clear, the Canadian American Business Council, we are 30 years old this year. And we were created as proponents of free trade and as champions for Canada-U.S. free trade in particular. Our members believe that with the global interconnectedness of the world, free trade is the right approach. So we like the idea of free trade. We really liked the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We thought that was a very good modern trading agreement to create rules of the road going forward. Unfortunately, the current U.S. government has stepped back from that. That may not hold back the other 13 countries, but it holds back the United States at the moment. So we like free trade around the world. Our next choice is Trans-Pacific, a big arrangement, and then transatlantic, modeling some perhaps on the Canada-EU agreement, which is currently the most modern agreement there is. But so free trade across the board, big blocks if you can get it. The more countries in, the better. So in the context of NAFTA, we think a trilateral negotiation makes a lot of sense, or a trilateral agreement, I should say, makes a lot of sense. So we're for that. We're already pretty well integrated in trilaterally. But our point is not to get hung up on that. So if it's politically impossible for various reasons, for the U.S. to move forward with a comprehensive economic relationship with Mexico, for various reasons, Mexican politics, U.S. politics, et cetera, then we think don't be delayed by that and move forward with a bilateral negotiation. So our point is we prefer TPP. Can't have TPP. We prefer trilateral. If you can't have trilateral, certainly we should move forward on a new agreement with Canada and the United States. We think it's doable and possible. The clerk has copies of my remarks that you asked for at the beginning, so I'm happy for you to have those, to make those available. And they're also, much of what we talk about is available on our website as well.
Peut-être une question. Désolée.
And perhaps the following question. Following your comments, it seems that you prefer global models. Do you fear a change in attitude and a hardening of attitude on the part of the American administration? In forums such as the World Trade Organization, I think at recent meetings, they've been trying to soften their language and remove certain phrases such as rule-based. So what's your opinion on the position of the new administration in that particular context?
Question. The administration, and I'll tie this with something that Mr. McKay said earlier, what the Trump administration is consistent on is wanting to promote American investment and stand up for what it perceives as unfair practices around the world. So this whole Make America Great Again, Put America First Again is real. And there's real support by millions of Americans for that idea. So that what that means is you have an aggressive trade enforcement regime. We see that with Secretary Ross. We see that with Mr. Navarro. I think you'll see that with Mr. Lighthizer when he's confirmed a U.S. Trade Representative. So you have a very America First attitude, and that is supported. That's politically popular in the United States, just as a Canada First popular, position would be in theory. Here, although Canadians are more globalist and more trade supporting as a general statement than Americans are at the moment politically. That having been said, you're right to observe that the president is flexible in his tactics and approaches. So whatever negotiating posture he thinks gets him the furthest along in what he needs to do is what he'll take. And I think the reality of the position of president is really sinking in. So whereas the campaign rhetoric was really strong, isolationist, America first and whatever, the reality of an interconnected world in U.S. foreign policy is you have to govern in a much more nuanced way. And I think we've seen that with the president not backing down on Russian sanctions, not calling out China as a currency manipulator, and all of the other things that he said. I think he's consistent in the America first idea. But I think the reality of a complicated foreign policy is dawning on him. But on trade in particular, enforcement will be what he leads with. And that is what is so troubling to our trading partners, in particular our best trading partner, which is right here in Canada. Merci.
Merci.
Mr. Levitt, please.
Good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us today at our committee. Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Black. I had the opportunity as chair of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights to travel with the members of our subcommittee to Washington just about 3 weeks ago. And we engaged in a number of discussions. We met with about 14 different members of Congress and a number of senators, too, during that time. And we had interesting discussions on mutual areas of agreement on human rights issues. We discussed South Sudan, Venezuela, Russia, the Rohingya, Myanmar, Iran, and a number of other common ground areas. What became fairly clear during those discussions was that there's still a bit of a vacuum created at the administration level in terms of future directions on some of those files. Now, some of the big ones, we've spoken about Iran and Russia here already today, but on many of the others, partially probably due to the lack of appointments in some of those areas or vacancies still to be filled, but also there just seems to be a bit of a disconnect in terms of where they stand in the administration. We've heard broadly about the slashing of international aid budgets, which is something that could happen within the next couple of years, if not immediately. How do you see this playing out? How do you see, even within the Republican Party, the pushback that may come on a number of files, but I guess I'm specifically dealing with international human rights, on even some pushback from within the Republicans, and how's he going to be able to manage Congress and the Senate moving forward on some of these international global affairs?
Well, as you know, there's always in American administrations some tension between those elements in the U.S. government and the Congress and the administration who put particular heavy emphasis on the observation of human rights in other countries, and those who adopt a somewhat, as long as things don't reach the level of colossal atrocities, feel that those are essentially internal matters of other countries and not a place for the United States to try and exercise. And I think maybe the Carter administration was the most activist in terms of using rights and the observation and respect of rights in different countries as criterion for the forthcoming goodwill of the United States in response to those countries. And the Nixon administration perhaps was on the other end of the scale. Well, it took notice of these things. It essentially dealt with who was there, unless they were so morally opprobrious. It was beneath the dignity of the United States to do it. And I would say that this administration would be somewhat closer to the Nixon model and well away from the Carter model. I think President Trump feels that in general, American interventionism recently, and indeed since the Korean War, when its military intervention has, with some exceptions, not been overly successful and has not been easily justified as a geopolitical investment. I mean, in the Middle East, virtually the entire conventional ground forces military capability of the United States was tied up in that area for over a decade, and approximately $2 trillion were spent. An immense humanitarian crisis was generated, and scores of thousands of casualties occurred in the case of the United States, and much larger numbers in other populations. And geopolitically, the U.S. doesn't have much to show for it. And that was quite prominent in the comments that the candidate took prior to the election. And certainly it resonated well with his voters. So I'm sure you would have encountered indications of that when you were in Washington, that this is an administration that takes note of the degree to which rights are observed, but is not going to become overly demonstrative or insistent about that subject unless it becomes really an atrocious situation on a vast scale. I think this administration, and any administration, any American administration from now on in either party, would be much more responsive than the Clinton administration was to what went on in Rwanda, for example, or the Carter administration to what went on in Kampuchea and Cambodia. And I think I'm hopeful, as I'm sure you are, that the world in general has got to the point where it will take radical measures to prevent another Darfur, any of these horrible disasters where huge numbers of people perish or are dislocated. But in terms of determining their policy, I think this administration will cut a fair bit of slack to almost any plausible government other than a failed state, that whatever it is doing, it has a right to do within its own borders. Now, it will become much more demonstrative about the exportation of aggression and particularly of terrorism. I think what you'll get in general is an administration that tries to give a much clearer definition of the U.S. national interest, rather in the way that President Truman and Secretary Acheson did just prior to the Korean War, and make it clear what the United States regards as its national interest. And it will be a much less ambitious definition than the George W. Bush administration had, but a much less pacifistic and passive one than the Obama administration had. But at least it will be clear. In the human rights area, I think this is an administration that would only really assert itself and use American political strength in case of violations of human rights on such a scale that they were repulsive to the American public.
And I think we probably saw that with the lashing out at Syria after the chemical weapons attack. That would probably fit the characterization.
And that was magnified by that appalling episode with the Red Line, followed by triumphalist noises in Washington that without any violence at all, they'd succeeded in having all the sarin gas removed, which of course was not the case. The country was lied to by the Syrians and the Russians, so you had an element of betrayal involved as well.
Thank you. Do I have a little more time?
No, Mr. Fragaskatos, please.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of you for being here today. Ms. Greenwood, you made an interesting comment earlier that Canada's corporate tax rate puts us as a country in a very competitive position. Now, I wasn't planning on asking about corporate tax rates, but I was intrigued by the comment. I wonder if you could follow that up.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Canada enjoys today a lower relative corporate tax rate than the United States. And if the U.S. lowers its rate in a significant way, which I believe will occur, I don't know what level it'll go to. That'll be the subject of a negotiation. I think that has the potential to have a big effect on Canadian competitiveness. And so when you combine, it's not just about tax rates, although that's really important, but when you combine, if in 2 years we have in the United States, a lower corporate tax rate, we have some version of a border adjustment tariff, we have some incentive to repatriate funds that come from overseas, and you combine that with a preference for American inputs and manufacturing buy and hire American, that's a fundamental challenge to Canadian corporate competitiveness. And so that's why we strongly advocate for Canada and the United States to go at this together, to have a complementary economic system, because that's what we've had not just since the NAFTA, not just since the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, not even just since the 1965 Canada-U.S. Auto Pact, which is what kind of started all this, but back in the 40s when we started free trade in agricultural equipment like tractors and combines and things like that. That's the approach we need to take, in my opinion, so that we're an economic unit. That's the way business deals with it. So if policymakers could get closer to that so that we can take on competitive challenges around the world, that would be better. But no, if we diverge and the United States under the Trump administration and the Republican leadership of the 115th Congress goes at what it says it's going to do, that creates some important questions for Canadian policymakers, to be sure.
Thank you very much. In January of 2017, you said the following in a CTV interview. No, it's just
Here we
fine.
go.
Don't worry. Your words are fine. But I do want to quote them back to you.
Sure.
Speaking from an American's perspective, you said, quote, well, who's our biggest export partner? It's Canada. So literally millions of American jobs are dependent on our relationship with Canada. I think the president-elect and his team are beginning to understand that. Do you believe that that is still the sense in Washington and across the United States, quite frankly?
I do believe that the education level is rising. Let me just take a moment to compliment. There's something called the Canada-U.S. War Room inside the Prime Minister's office. It's led by a gentleman named Brian Clow. He's got a terrific team. They're really smart and really good, and they are helping guide, along with Ambassador McNaughton, who's enormously talented, and members of all parties, and the former Prime Minister. So this is not a partisan or a government-only comment, but I do think there has been a lot of progress made in raising awareness. I think, though, you have to keep it up. You've got to keep coming to Washington, and not just Washington, but all over the United States, because I think there have been over 125 touch points in the first 100 days of the administration from Canadian policymakers to U.S. policymakers, and that feels like a lot from up here, but you've got to keep it up, because every single interest group in the United States camps out on Capitol Hill. So if you have 125 touch points, the American meat producers have, 10,000, and they are constituents. So, but the facts are important, the reality is important, and millions of American jobs and the American prosperity does rely on our interconnected economy with Canada, and that needs to continue. And, the president said that he decided not to tear up NAFTA after phone calls from Prime Minister Trudeau and the president of Mexico. I think that's partially true, but I think another big factor was that Sonny Perdue, former governor of Georgia, who is now the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, came with an infographic to say in the agriculture sector, if we were to tear up NAFTA, that would be a giant detriment to American farmers. And I think that resonated as much with the President of the United States as any argument that a foreign leader made, as important as those were.
Thank you very much. One last question, and it's for Mr. Black. Mr. Black, I wonder what you would make of arguments that suggest that Canada ought to really diversify its economy. I mean, we've heard this argument for decades, and we've pivoted in this direction, obviously, with respect to Europe and the recent CETA agreement. But talk for a moment, if you could, on the issue of China, perhaps even India, and free trade agreements along those lines.
Yeah, Mr. Fragaskatis, I believe at the height of the intimacy in trade terms between the United States and Canada, approximately 85% of Canada's foreign trade was with the United States, and that was roughly half that figure was the percentage of tied up in that, which is, I would have thought, as great a level of integration with the U.S. economy as the state of California possessed at that time. But I believe that number now, the 85%, is down to 70-some, 73 or something. So I think it is gradually happening, and I think it is a good thing. Not that we want to get away from trade with the United States, but it is generally a good thing to be more broadly based in international transactions, I think. And I think it is a natural trend anyway. I make 2 points, if I could, related to your previous question to Ms. Greenwood. The one area where I think we should be prepared for a real divergence, but I'm not exactly sure and have no competence to say how determined our government is in this matter, is on all this business about carbon taxes and activities based on presumptions about global warming. We are not going to be operating on a parallel line with the present American administration on that point, and I think that is clear from directives that have already been implemented in respect of the Environmental Protection Agency. But I also want to make the point that in tearing up NAFTA and so forth, Donald Trump has never expressed any problem at all with Canada-U.S. free trade. I mean, slight tweaking, I believe, was his expression when the Prime Minister and others visited him. But his problem is he's not a protectionist. He is actually in favor of trade. What he does not like is trade that consists of a net sizable exportation of unemployment to the United States. And he's well aware that there are 12 million jobs in the U.S. dependent on exports, but he's also aware that there are between 30 and 40 million jobs elsewhere in the world dependent on exports to the United States. And he just wants to reduce that imbalance. He doesn't want to lift the drawbridge and pull down the blinds and and to take America first as a policy in the sense meant by Colonel Lindbergh in 1940. He just wants fair trade. So we're not dealing with a monster here. We're dealing with a reasonable person who just wants to do a good job for his country. Well, so do all national leaders. In that sense, he's not unusual.
Colleagues, I want to wrap this very interesting discussion this morning by thanking Ms. Greenwood and Mr. Black for coming before the committee. It's always too short. I wished we could do this all afternoon. Beats being in the House of Commons, I think. But this is part of the House of Commons. So I want to thank both our witnesses today. This is an extremely important debate and one that we will continue. So on behalf of the committee, thank you for making the time and putting the effort in being here today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Mr. No. I'm sorry I was a bit late. It wasn't an accident. It was the John Tory traffic miracle in Toronto.
Well, I appreciate that clarification, and we'll make sure Mr. Tory fixes that. The Scarborough subway is on its way.
Subway will solve it.
Now, colleagues, I'm going to go in camera just for 2 minutes. I got a couple motions that I have to get completed. One in particular, otherwise we can't send invitations. So we will now go into camera for just a couple minutes, if you don't mind.